The call came at 2:14 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway. The kind of sleeplessness that hits men in their 60s when the joints ache and the mind won't quiet down. My phone lit up the ceiling of my bedroom in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and I saw my niece's name on the screen. She never called this late, she texted. She sent memes about dogs. She did not call at 2:14 on a Wednesday in January. Uncle Ray. Her voice was wrong. Too thin, too careful, the way a person sounds when they're trying not to fall apart in a public place. I'm at the hospital. At the QEII. Can you come? I was already sitting up. What happened? Are you hurt? It's my wrist. They're putting a cast on it. Stepmother says I slipped on the ice outside, but Uncle Ray. A pause. That's not what happened. I need you to come before they make me go home. I'm a high school vice principal. I've been one for 11 years, and before that I taught history for 14. In that time, I've sat across the table from hundreds of teenagers and learned to hear the difference between a kid exaggerating for effect and a kid saying something true that they've never said out loud before. My niece Becca was 17 years old, and she was telling me something true. I'm leaving right now, I said. Which floor? Emergency. Bay 7. Uncle Ray, please hurry. Dad believes whatever Joanna tells him. The drive from my apartment in Dartmouth to the QEII Health Sciences Center on South Street takes 20 minutes on a normal night. Roads were clear, city was quiet, and I pushed the speed limit the whole way. My brother Warren had married Joanna Szymanski 14 months ago, 18 months after his first wife, Becca's mother, died from an aggressive breast cancer that took her in less than a year. Warren was a good man. He was also a man who had been so hollowed out by grief that when someone came along and offered warmth and structure and the appearance of normalcy, he hadn't questioned it the way he should have. I had never been able to articulate exactly what bothered me about Joanna. She was attractive and professionally polished, worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove a leased BMW. She laughed at Warren's jokes a beat too late, like she was calculating when to laugh rather than actually finding them funny. She treated Becca with a kind of brittle courtesy, the sort that looks like warmth from a distance but has no actual heat in it. I'd said something vague to Warren once, 8 months in. He'd gotten defensive and I'd backed off because what was I going to say? She laughs at the wrong time? I don't like the way she looks at your daughter? Now my niece was at the hospital at 2 in the morning with a broken wrist and a story that didn't match. The emergency department was brighter than the night outside, that particular fluorescent harshness that makes everyone look slightly unwell. A nurse at triage checked her screen when I gave Becca's name and then looked at me the way people do when they know more than they're saying. She's in Bay 7 with her father and stepmother. The doctor is finishing up. I'm her uncle. She called me specifically. I'll let them know you're here. Something in her expression shifted slightly. The attending tonight is Dr. Ferreira. He's been very attentive to her case. Very attentive. I filed that phrase away. The curtain to Bay 7 was half drawn. I heard Warren before I saw him, his low voice trying to soothe, and then Joanna's clearer one. She needs to be more careful. We've talked about the boots, Becca. I've said a dozen times those soles are useless on ice. I stepped around the curtain, and Becca saw me immediately. The relief on her face was the kind you can't fake. Her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together hard, fighting it. Her right wrist was being casted by a technician, the fiberglass wrap still damp-looking, pale blue against her pale skin. Her left shoulder sat wrong somehow, not quite level, and there was something at her jawline, redness that could have been from cold, but wasn't the right shape for cold. Ray. Warren stood and hugged me. He looked tired in a way that had become permanent lately. You didn't have to come out. Becca called me. Of course I came. I looked over his shoulder at Joanna, who was watching me with a careful smile. She was in her 40s, fit, with the kind of composed look that takes daily effort to maintain. Even at 2 a.m. she was composed. That bothered me. Ray, she said warmly. What a good uncle you are. What happened? I directed the question at Becca. Warren answered. She went out to get something from the car and slipped on the front step. The ice was terrible tonight. I keep meaning to put down more salt. Dad. Becca's voice was flat. Honey, I know it hurt, but... Dad. She said it again, and this time Warren stopped. The curtain moved, and a man in his late 40s entered, tablet in hand, stethoscope around his neck. His name tag read, Dr. Paulo Ferreira. He looked at each of us in turn, and then settled his attention on me with a slight pause that said he'd been briefed on the family configuration. Mr. Morrison. Ray Morrison. I'm Becca's uncle. She asked to have you stay with her. That's fine. He turned to Warren and Joanna. I was hoping to speak with you both in the consultation room for a few minutes. Just some standard follow-up questions about her care plan going forward. Joanna touched Warren's arm. Of course. Her voice was helpful, cooperative, the voice of a person with nothing to hide. They followed the doctor out. I pulled a chair beside Becca's bed and sat down while the casting technician worked quietly at her wrist. Tell me, I said quietly. She looked at the technician. He didn't look up. His expression was the studied neutrality of someone who has learned to be invisible when families need privacy. We were arguing, Becca said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. About my mom's jewelry. Mom left me her ring, her grandmother's ring, and I wanted to wear it to the winter formal next month. Joanna said it was too old-fashioned, that I should wear the pendant she gave me for Christmas instead. Becca paused. I said the pendant didn't mean anything to me the way the ring does. I said she wasn't my mother, and she didn't get to decide. She stopped, swallowed, and then she grabbed me. I kept my voice level. Where? My wrist, the one they're casting. She grabbed it hard and twisted it and said I was an ungrateful little girl who needed to learn some manners. And when I tried to pull away, I lost my balance on the kitchen floor and fell into the counter and hit my shoulder. Becca touched her left shoulder carefully, experimentally. Dad was upstairs. He heard the bang and came down, and Joanna told him I'd gone outside for something and slipped on the step and come in crying. And he believed her. He always believes her. There was no heat in it. Just a tired resignation that was worse than anger. I tried to tell him on the way here. I said, Joanna did this. He looked at me, and then he looked at her, and she had this expression, this sad expression, like she was hurt, that I would say such a thing. And he said, Becca, honey, I know you're in pain, but let's not do this right now. I sat with that for a moment. The casting technician finished, made a few notes on a small clipboard, and quietly left. Has this happened before? A long pause. Not like this, but she's grabbed me before. Shoved me once, in the laundry room, when Dad was at work. She said if I made trouble for her marriage, she'd make sure I understood what trouble actually looked like. Becca. How long? About 4 months after they got married. So almost a year. A year. She'd been carrying this for almost a year. Why didn't you call me sooner? She looked down at the blue cast. Because I didn't think you'd believe me either. Because she's really good at being normal in front of people. And because I didn't want to make things harder for Dad. He was so sad after Mom died. When he started smiling again, I didn't want to be the reason he stopped. 17 years old, and she'd been protecting her father at her own expense for almost a year. My jaw ached from keeping my expression neutral. You're not going home tonight, I said. Dat won't. Let me handle your dad. You're not going home tonight. Dr. Ferreira came back alone a few minutes later. He looked at Becca, then at me, then seemed to make a decision. The injury pattern is something I want to document carefully, he said, keeping his voice low and professional. The fracture itself is consistent with a twisting force applied to the wrist, not a fall on an outstretched hand, which is typically what we see in slip and fall accidents. The shoulder bruising is also consistent with blunt impact rather than a fall. He paused. I've taken photographs and included detailed notes in her file. What are your options? I asked. Without Becca, or a parent or guardian confirming an alternate account of the injury, I'm limited in what I can escalate. But I want you to know that everything is documented. If this goes anywhere officially, there's a medical record. He looked at Becca directly. You did the right thing calling your uncle. Becca nodded without speaking. Warren came back to the bay alone a few minutes after that. He looked at Becca and then at me, and I could see the uncertainty in his face, the look of a man who was holding two incompatible versions of reality and didn't know which one to put down. Where's Joanna? I asked. She went to get coffee. There's a Tim Hortons on the main floor. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me. Ray, you're looking at me like I did something wrong. I'm not. I'm looking at you like I'm worried about your daughter. Warren rubbed his face. He'd aged in the last 2 years. The grief had done that, sharpened some things, softened others. She slipped on the ice. Dad. Becca's voice was quiet but steady. Please just listen to me. I know you love her. I know she makes you happy. But Joanna grabbed my wrist and twisted it, and that's how it broke. She shoved me into the counter. I have a bruise on my shoulder, and it's in the shape of the corner of the counter because that's what I hit. Warren opened his mouth. I'm not lying, Becca said. I never lie to you. I didn't lie when I was 12 and broke Mom's favorite mug playing basketball in the kitchen. I didn't lie when I crashed your car into the mailbox last spring. I'm not lying now. The three of us sat in silence. The emergency department moved around us, nurses passing, monitors beeping softly. I want Becca to stay with me for a few days, I said finally, while the wrist heals. I've got the spare room, and I can drive her to school from Dartmouth. Just give her some space and some time. Warren looked like a man standing at the edge of something he wasn't sure he wanted to step off. Ray, she's your daughter, Warren. My voice came out more quietly than I intended. She called me at 2 in the morning. She called me because she needed someone in her corner. I held his gaze. I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight. Just let her come stay with me while you think. Joanna returned from Tim Hortons with 2 cups of coffee and a bright, concerned expression. She took in the configuration of the room with a single, quick assessment that most people wouldn't have noticed. I noticed. How are we doing? She asked warmly, handing Warren a cup. Becca's going to stay with Ray for a few days, Warren said. His voice was careful. Something moved behind Joanna's eyes. Not quite alarm, not quite calculation, but something in between. It was gone before most people would have caught it. Of course. Whatever helps her recover. She looked at Becca with an expression of soft concern that would have been convincing if I hadn't been watching for the edges of it. You'll rest and take care of that wrist. I will, Becca said flatly. The discharge paperwork took 40 minutes. Warren helped Becca into her coat, walked her to my car, and hugged her for a long moment in the parking garage. Over her shoulder, he looked at me, and I could see that he was frightened, though not of the right things yet. I'll call you tomorrow, I said. He nodded and walked back toward the entrance without turning around. Becca was quiet for most of the drive across the bridge. The harbor was dark and still below the McDonald Bridge, Halifax lights reflecting in the water. Thank you, she said finally. I didn't know who else to call. You called exactly the right person. My apartment is small, 2 bedrooms, the second one set up as a home office that I converted to a guest room years ago after my own divorce. I gave Becca the good pillow and her pain medication and watched her fall asleep with a speed that told me she hadn't been sleeping well for a long time. Then I made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table and started writing things down. I've spent 25 years watching teenagers navigate the space between what's true and what adults choose to believe. I know how they perform dishonesty, the tells, the way their eyes move, the over-explanation. I know what it looks like when they're telling the truth and afraid no one will accept it. Becca had been telling the truth. What I needed now was to understand who Joanna Szymanski actually was outside of the version she presented to my brother. Her LinkedIn profile showed exactly what you'd expect. 14 years in pharmaceutical sales, consistent promotions, a series of professional headshots in which she projected competent warmth. She'd been in Halifax for 3 years. Before that, Fredericton. Before that, Moncton. 3 cities in 8 years. Job changes that could mean ambition or could mean something else. I dug into public records for a few hours. The kind of thing you can do if you know where to look and you're patient. Joanna had been married before. The divorce from a man named Timothy Fawcett had been finalized in Moncton 7 years ago. Timothy Fawcett still lived in Moncton, ran an accounting practice, had a public professional profile. I drafted an email at 4 in the morning, aware that this was unusual and possibly unwelcome. My name is Ray Morrison. I'm a high school administrator in Halifax. I'm contacting you about a delicate family matter involving Joanna Szymanski, who I understand was your former wife. She's recently married my brother. I have concerns about the safety of my 17-year-old niece. I'm not asking you to share anything you're not comfortable sharing. I'm only asking if you'd be willing to speak with me. This is about a child's safety. I included my phone number and sent it before I could reconsider. Becca slept until 10. I made scrambled eggs and we sat at the kitchen table and she talked, slowly, and then with increasing steadiness, about the years she'd spent navigating Joanna's presence in her home. It had started with small things. Joanna, quietly repositioning herself as the person who coordinated the household, managing Warren's calendar, making decisions about dinner and schedules, and how the house was organized. Becca's input was invited, but her preferences were consistently overruled in ways that were always framed as reasonable. You're a teenager. You don't understand mortgage payments. Your dad works so hard. We shouldn't burden him with that. This is just the way adults manage a household. Then came the closer management of Becca herself. Questions about where she was going and who she was with that felt less like parental interest and more like surveillance. Comments about Becca's friends, her clothes, her grades, the way she spoke, all of it delivered in a tone of thoughtful concern that was difficult to argue against without sounding unreasonable. She told me once that my mom would have wanted her to help shape me into a woman my mother would be proud of, Becca said. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. She uses my mom, brings her up whenever she wants me to do something I don't want to do. I put my fork down. She brings up your mother to justify things, like having access to my room or reading my journal that one time. She said she found it by accident, but she quoted from it afterward, things I'd written when I was really sad about Mom. And she said she'd read them because she was worried about my mental health, and she wanted to make sure I was okay. The manipulation had been thorough and patient, and it had been built, at least in part, on the foundation of a dead woman's memory. I felt something cold and settled in my chest. Did you ever tell your school counselor? Becca was quiet for a moment. I talked to Miss Tremblay once. Sort of. I didn't say everything. I said I was having a hard time adjusting to my dad's remarriage, and she said that was normal and suggested some group sessions for teens dealing with blended families. A pause. It wasn't really what I needed. Okay, Uncle Ray, what are you going to do? I'm going to do this carefully, I said. Because Joanna sounds like someone who's very good at presenting herself as the reasonable one, which means we can't approach this emotionally. We have to approach it with documentation. My phone rang just after noon. A 506 area code. Moncton. Mr. Morrison. A man's voice, measured and careful. This is Timothy Fawcett. I got your email. I thanked him for calling. He was quiet for a moment. How old is your niece? 17. I see. Another pause. I have a daughter. She was 15 when Joanna and I separated. I'll tell you what I can. What Timothy Fawcett told me over the following 30 minutes was less dramatic than I had feared, and more systematic than I had imagined. The marriage had deteriorated gradually. Joanna's need for control over the household had been total and had extended increasingly to his daughter Paige from his first marriage. He described a pattern of subtle undermining, a patient erosion of Paige's confidence and standing within the family. The physical stuff only happened once that I know of, Timothy said. Joanna grabbed Paige's arm during an argument and left bruising. Paige told me, but Joanna had an explanation ready. She said Paige had been hysterical, and she'd just been trying to calm her down, that Paige had overreacted. He paused. I believe Joanna. That's the part I'll never fully get over. My daughter came to me and I believed my wife instead. What changed? Paige's school called me. One of her teachers had noticed the bruising and had a conversation with her that I wasn't part of. When I found out that Paige had told a teacher what happened, rather than trying to tell me again, I understood that I had failed her. His voice was flat, with the flatness of a regret that has been processed many times. I ended the marriage. Joanna contested everything, made me look unreliable, paranoid. But I got out, and I got Paige out. Would Paige be willing to speak with anyone, or provide any kind of statement? A long pause. She's 22 now, finishing her master's degree in Ontario. She's put a lot of distance between herself and those years. Another pause. Let me ask her. She should know what's happening. I called my old colleague Diane Burgess next. Diane had spent 15 years as a social worker before becoming a consultant for schools on child welfare issues. She picked up on the second ring, and I explained the situation. You're in a complicated spot, she said when I finished. Becca's 17, close enough to 18 that any official process moves slowly relative to her timeline. Her father is the custodial parent, and he's not currently acknowledging abuse. But the medical documentation is useful, very useful. And if you can establish a pattern across multiple victims, that changes the weight of what you're bringing. What would you do? Build the case. Keep Becca safe in the meantime. And try to get through to the father. Because honestly, in these situations, the fastest path to protection is almost always a parent finally seeing clearly. Warren called that evening. I let it go 3 rings before answering, wanting him to have sat with the silence a moment longer. "How's she doing?" he asked. "Her wrist is uncomfortable, but she's okay. She slept well." "Ray." A long breath. "I've been thinking all day." "I know you have." "She really believes that Joanna—" "Warren." I stopped him gently. "Becca doesn't exaggerate. You know that. You've known her for 17 years, and you know she doesn't exaggerate. When have you known her to invent something?" Silence. "She has a bruise on her shoulder," I said, "the shape of a counter corner. Dr. Ferreira documented it with photographs. The fracture in her wrist shows torsional force, like a twisting grip, not the impact pattern of a fall." "But why would Joanna—" They were arguing about her mother's ring. Becca wanted to wear it to a school dance. Joanna wanted her to wear the pendant instead. Becca said Joanna wasn't her mother and didn't get to decide. I paused. "Warren, she's been managing this for almost a year. There have been other incidents. She didn't tell you because she didn't think you'd believe her over Joanna." The silence on the line was the silence of a man realizing something Judy didn't want to know. "I have to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to answer it honestly. Not in relation to Joanna, in relation to your own memory. In the last year, have you noticed anything? Any moment where you thought something seemed off and then told yourself you were being paranoid?" A very long pause. "She's isolated from her friends," Warren said finally. His voice was quiet. "She used to have 3 or 4 girls she was always texting. The last 6 months, they barely come around. When I asked Becca about it, she said they'd just drifted. But—" He stopped. But Joanna always had a reason why this friend was a bad influence, or that friends' parents were inappropriate, and I accepted it. I was relieved, actually. Fewer people in the house. Less noise." His voice cracked slightly at the end. "Ray, I know. I've been an idiot. You've been a grieving man who wanted to believe things were okay. That's not the same thing." "It might be." I let him sit with that. "I need you to come over tomorrow," Warren said finally. "With Becca. I want to talk to her properly. I want her to know I'm listening. She needs to know you believe her first." "I do believe her." His voice was quiet and certain now in a way it hadn't been hours before. "I think I've believed her since she tried to tell me in the car, and I looked at Joanna instead of at her. I met Paige Fawcett on a video call 2 days later, arranged through Timothy. She was poised in the careful way of someone who has worked hard to be okay. She listened to what I described, and then she talked for 40 minutes. She was precise and clear, and she said at the end, "If what you need is a statement, I'll give one. I should have given one years ago. I was too scared and too young, and I thought no one would believe a teenager over an adult. But I'm not 17 anymore." Warren asked Joanna to leave the house the day after my conversation with him. She resisted in exactly the way Timothy Fawcett had predicted. Hurt, calm, strategic. She told Warren he was having a breakdown, that grief did strange things to people's judgment, that Becca had been manipulating him against her since the beginning because she couldn't accept her mother's replacement. Warren sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it with the expression of a man who was hearing a language he'd forgotten he used to speak. "I need you to leave," he said when she finished. "I'll have someone bring your things." The legal process was slow and not particularly satisfying. Joanna had good representation and no criminal record. With Dr. Ferreira's medical documentation, Paige's written statement, and Timothy Fawcett's corroborating account of the incident involving his daughter, the case had enough weight to proceed, but it proceeded on Joanna's timeline through a series of negotiations and postponements. In the end, she accepted a peace bond and a formal record of the proceedings. No prison time. She moved to Ontario sometime in the following months. Warren tracked down the information secondhand and chose not to follow it any further. There was nothing more to track, and closure, he decided, was not the same thing as revenge. What mattered was what came after. Becca wore her mother's ring to the winter formal in February, a small gold band with a pale blue aquamarine that had belonged to her great-grandmother. She sent me a photo. She was standing with two friends she'd been slowly reconnecting with since Joanna's departure, and she was smiling the way people smile when they've stopped bracing for something. Warren called me on a Tuesday evening in April. A clear call with nothing specific to say, just talking, the way brothers do when things are finally quiet enough to talk. I'm sitting on the balcony of my Dartmouth apartment as I write this, looking across the harbor at the Halifax skyline. It was a mild evening. Things in Nova Scotia in spring, the kind of evening that makes the winter feel very far away. I've spent a quarter-century in schools watching young people navigate things they shouldn't have to navigate alone. I understand something about the difference between a crisis that announces itself and one that moves quietly through a household for months before anyone with the right vantage point notices. Becca noticed. She endured it for almost a year, absorbing it, protecting her father from additional pain, telling herself it would get better, or that she was misreading it, or that no one would believe her anyway. And then she called me at 2, 14 inches the morning from a hospital bay with a broken wrist, and she found the words, and the right person picked up the phone. That's what I tell teachers in the workshops I've started running with Diane Burgess. Not the dramatic version, not the version with the obvious villain, the quiet version. The one where the signs are subtle and the victim is protecting someone else and the person doing harm is very practiced at appearing reasonable. I tell them, believe the young person in front of you. Ask the second question. Notice when a story doesn't match the evidence, because the call you need to be ready for is never the one you're expecting. It comes at 2, 14 inches the morning from a 17-year-old who has run out of other options. And the only thing that matters in that moment is that someone answers. I've thought about that phone call many times since. 2, 14 inches the morning. A 17-year-old girl with a broken wrist, sitting in a hospital bay, choosing to call me instead of anyone else, because she'd calculated, correctly, that I was the one most likely to believe her. That calculation breaks my heart a little every time I think about it. She'd been living with this for nearly a year, absorbing it quietly, and the person she'd decided to trust wasn't her father. It was her uncle. That's not a coincidence. That's the result of everything that had happened before that night. What I keep coming back to is the chain of it. Not in any mystical sense, just the plain, observable chain of choices and consequences that led everyone in this story to exactly where they ended up. Joanna had spent years constructing a version of herself that was very difficult to argue against. Patient, composed, always the reasonable one. She'd done it before, in Moncton, with Timothy's daughter Paige. It had worked then. No charges, no record, a clean exit, and a fresh start in a new city. That success is what made her bolder. The thing she didn't account for was Becca's decision to make one phone call. And what I keep thinking about Becca is the courage that took. Not the dramatic kind of courage, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet kind. She'd spent months telling herself to stay small, to manage it, to protect her father from more pain. And then something in her decided that she'd reached the end of what she could carry alone. She didn't perform distress on that call. She was precise. She told me what floor she was on. She told me what she needed. That's not a frightened child grasping at anything. That's someone who had thought it through and decided to trust someone with the truth. I think about Warren too, and I try to do it without judgment, even though some part of me still wants to be angry with him. He'd been so flattened by grief after losing his wife that when comfort arrived, he accepted it without examining it carefully enough. That's not weakness exactly. It's what happens when a person is operating below their own capacity for a long time, when they're just trying to get through the days without falling apart. The cost of that, in his case, was that his daughter paid part of the bill. He knows that. We've talked about it. He's been honest with himself about it in a way that I think took real effort, and that honesty is what allowed him and Becca to rebuild something genuine afterward. The thing I try to communicate now, when I talk to teachers and counselors in the workshops Diane and I run, is that cases like Becca's rarely look dramatic from the outside. The person doing harm is almost always the one who appears most reasonable. The child is almost always the one who seems difficult, oversensitive, prone to exaggeration. The system is set up, in a way, to make it easy to dismiss the version that's harder to hear. which means the only thing that actually changes outcomes is a person deciding to listen past the comfortable version, to ask the second question, to notice when the injury doesn't match the explanation, and follow that thread even when following it is inconvenient. Becca wore her mother's ring to her school formal in February. She sent me a photo. She was smiling the way people smile when they've stopped waiting for something bad to happen. That's what I think about when the work feels slow, or the system feels immovable. One phone call, answered. One person who decided to believe a 17-year-old girl at 2:14 the morning. It was enough.